captured by an Apache woman tribe after getting lost. Their queen claims he was chosen. 0. John Thompson had always loved the outdoors. He had grown up in a small town near the mountains and had spent countless weekends exploring trails, rivers, and forests. Hiking was not just a hobby for him. It was a way to feel alive, to escape the noise of the modern world, and to test his own strength and endurance. On this particular trip, John decided to take a solo journey into the vast wilderness of Arizona. He wanted to challenge himself on a trail that few had traveled, a rugged landscape filled with canyons, cliffs, and desert valleys. Early that morning, John packed his backpack carefully. He brought a water bottle, a small amount of food, a compass, a map, and a first aid kit. He also carried a small notebook to record his thoughts and the natural wonders he might see. As he set off, the sun rose behind him, casting a golden glow over the rocky terrain. The air was dry and crisp, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and wildflowers. Birds chirped in the distance, and the wind whispered through the canyon walls. John felt a rush of excitement. This was exactly what he had been waiting for. The thrill of stepping into the unknown. The trail started easy enough. It wound along the edge of a shallow canyon with small shrubs and cacti dotting the landscape. John walked briskly, his boots crunching against the gravel, enjoying the rhythm of the hike. He stopped occasionally to admire the scenery, jot down notes in his notebook, and take photographs of unusual rock formations. Everything seemed peaceful, almost magical. But John, confident in his experience, made a critical mistake. He decided to take a shortcut, a narrow path that cut through a series of rocky ridges. At first, the shortcut seemed clever. The rocks were steep but manageable, and the path promised to save time. John moved carefully, balancing himself on loose stones, his heart racing with the thrill of adventure. But as he climbed higher, he realized the trail was disappearing. Loose rocks tumbled under his feet, and the ridges became jagged and dangerous. The landscape around him stretched endlessly, a maze of canyons and cliffs. John tried to retrace his steps, but everything looked the same. The trail he had taken vanished entirely. Panic began to creep in. By midday, John was completely lost. He checked his compass and map, but the landmarks did not match what he saw. The sun was high, making the desert heat oppressive. His water was running low, and he had eaten only a small portion of his food. The wind picked up, blowing sand into his eyes and mouth. He called out, hoping someone nearby might hear, but the only response was the echo of his own voice bouncing off the canyon walls. Anxiety gnawed at him. He had always prepared for emergencies, but nothing could have fully prepared him for this vast, unmarked wilderness. As the hours passed, John's confidence began to falter. He realized he was surrounded by unfamiliar terrain in every direction. The canyon walls towered above him, casting deep shadows that shifted as the sun moved across the sky. Small animals scurried through the brush, and distant birds circled high overhead, but there were no signs of other humans. He felt completely isolated, as if he had stepped into a world that existed far away from civilization. Each step became heavier, and exhaustion began to set in. By late afternoon, John's physical condition was worsening. His throat was dry, his stomach ached from hunger, and his legs trembled from fatigue. He found a small shaded area near a narrow creek and decided to rest. He drank the little water he had left and tried to eat a small snack, but his appetite was gone. Sitting there, he tried to plan his next move. Should he continue searching for a way out, or stay put and hope someone found him? Every option seemed risky. The canyon stretched endlessly in every direction, and without clear markers, there was no way to know which path might lead to safety. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, John faced a new danger: darkness. The desert night could be cold and unforgiving, and navigating rocky terrain without light was extremely dangerous. Shadows deepened, and the air grew colder with each passing minute. John's heart pounded as he realized he might have to spend the night lost in the wilderness. He gathered some dry branches and leaves, attempting to build a small fire. After several failed attempts, he finally managed a tiny flame. It was not much, but it gave him a small sense of comfort and warmth. Night fully settled in, and with it came a silence that was almost deafening. The desert seemed to hold its breath, and John felt the weight of isolation more than ever. Strange sounds echoed through the canyon: the rustle of unseen creatures, the distant howl of a coyote, and the whisper of wind through the rocks. Every sound startled him, making him jump. He realized how vulnerable he truly was, and for the first time, fear replaced his earlier excitement. He tried to focus on staying calm, breathing slowly, and conserving his energy. Hours passed slowly, and John struggled to keep his mind alert. He knew that panic would only make the situation worse. He thought about his family, his friends, and the life he would return to if he could make it through the night. He repeated reassuring thoughts to himself, reminding himself of all the hiking experience he had gained over the years. Still, sleep was impossible. He lay on the hard ground, listening to the night around him, constantly alert for any signs of danger. Every movement in the shadows made his heart race. Just when exhaustion threatened to take over completely, John heard something unusual: the soft sound of footsteps, careful and deliberate, moving toward him from the darkness. His body froze. He could barely breathe. The sound was unlike anything he had expected. It was human, yet quiet and controlled, almost as if whoever was coming did not want to be noticed. Panic and curiosity battled inside him. Should he call out? Should he hide? He had no idea what he was about to face. Moments later, faint figures emerged from the shadows. John could barely make them out, but they were clearly people, women, dressed in clothing he had never seen before, with bows slung over their shoulders and a sense of authority in their movements. They did not rush toward him, but neither did they retreat. They simply observed, circling him carefully, speaking in low, melodic tones he could not understand. John's fear mingled with awe. He had never imagined encountering anything like this in the middle of the desert. One of the women stepped forward, and John could see her clearly now. She was taller than the others, her posture commanding, her eyes sharp and intelligent. There was a calmness about her, an air of control that made John feel both cautious and strangely reassured. He instinctively bowed slightly, unsure of what to do, trying to communicate that he meant no harm. The woman studied him carefully, as if weighing his intentions. The other women glanced at each other, their expressions unreadable, but there was no sign of aggression. John realized, with a mixture of relief and fear, that he had been found by a group of people who lived entirely outside the world he knew. He did not know whether they were friendly or whether he had stumbled into a dangerous situation he could not control. His mind raced with questions. Who were they? Where had they come from? Why were they here, so far from any settlement? The woman who had approached finally spoke, and although he could not understand the words, her tone carried a strange authority. It was clear she was a leader, someone whose decisions mattered deeply to the others. For the first time in hours, John felt a glimmer of hope. He was no longer completely alone, but he also understood that the next moments would define everything: how he acted, how he responded, and whether these people would see him as a threat or as someone to help. As he took a deep breath and prepared to speak, He knew that his journey had entered a new, unimaginable chapter. The wilderness was no longer the only challenge. Now, he had entered a world that was alive with mystery, culture, and human complexity. A world he had never imagined he would encounter. John Thompson's heart was still racing as he tried to make sense of the strange scene before him. The women stood quietly, their eyes fixed on him, moving with a grace and confidence that both intimidated and fascinated him. He wanted to speak, to ask questions, but the words caught in his throat. They did not look angry or hostile, but their silent observation made him acutely aware of his vulnerability. Every instinct in him screamed caution, yet a part of him could not help but feel awe. These were people entirely in tune with the land around them, as if the desert itself moved with them. After a moment that felt like an eternity, one of the women, the one who had stepped forward earlier, motioned for him to follow. She spoke softly, though he could not understand the language, her gestures clear enough. She wanted him to come. With a mixture of curiosity and caution, John nodded, keeping his hands visible at all times. He rose slowly, feeling the stiff ache in his muscles from his long day of wandering in fear. The woman turned and walked ahead, and the others followed, their movements quiet and deliberate. John followed, trying to match their pace without stumbling over the uneven rocks. As they moved deeper into the canyon, John's eyes widened. The terrain was unlike anything he had seen before. Hidden crevices and narrow paths wound between towering cliffs, and he could see how easily someone could get lost here. The women navigated it effortlessly, stepping over rocks, brushing past cacti, and balancing on narrow ledges. John struggled to keep up, slipping once on loose gravel, and the group paused, waiting for him to regain his footing. Despite his embarrassment, he was struck by their patience. They did not scold him or express frustration. They simply waited, silently, with an almost regal calm. After what felt like an hour of careful climbing and walking, they arrived at a hidden valley surrounded by steep cliffs on all sides. The valley seemed like a secret world, lush with green shrubs, trees, and a small, clear river that ran through the center. John could hardly believe his eyes. In the middle of this hidden place was a village, built entirely of natural materials. Tents and small structures made of wood, stone, and animal hides were scattered along the riverbank. Smoke rose from a few small fires, and he could hear the soft murmur of voices and the occasional laugh. The place felt alive yet peaceful, hidden from the rest of the world. The women led John into the village slowly. He noticed that the people here were all women, of various ages, moving with purpose and confidence. They were engaged in tasks he had seen in documentaries, gathering water, tending small gardens, crafting tools, and preparing food over fires. Yet there was something different here, a harmony, an unspoken order that guided every action. John realized that he was witnessing a society that had lived in this land for generations, far from modern civilization, yet completely self-sufficient and organized. The woman who had guided him finally stopped near a larger structure at the center of the village. It was built from thick wood and stones, with intricate carvings along the walls. John sensed immediately that this building was important. The other women gathered around, watching him as he tried to absorb everything. Then, the leader gestured for him to sit on a flat stone near the entrance. John obeyed, feeling both nervous and honored. He had been treated as an intruder just moments ago, yet now he felt like a guest, though he could not understand why. It was then that the leader spoke again. Her voice was calm, deep, and commanding, though he could not understand the words. She gestured to her chest, then toward him, and finally toward the sky. John guessed that she was trying to communicate something significant, perhaps asking who he was and why he had come. He used simple gestures, pointing to himself and speaking his name, John. He then pointed to the sun, the mountains, and the path he had taken. The woman listened, her expression serious but not unkind. She nodded slowly and spoke to the other women, who began to move around him with soft murmurs and occasional gestures. One of the younger women brought him water in a small carved bowl, and another offered a piece of flatbread. John accepted gratefully, his throat dry from hours in the desert. He drank and ate slowly, aware that this simple act of sharing food carried a deeper meaning in this culture. He felt the weight of their attention on him, but also a strange warmth, a sense that they were not here to harm him, but to understand him, and perhaps to teach him. Over the next few hours, John observed the village with wide eyes. He saw women teaching younger girls how to fish, how to hunt small animals, how to make tools and clothing. There was no harshness in their instructions, only patience and repetition. Each person had a role, and everyone seemed to know what to do without needing to be told. He realized that this was a society built on respect, skill, and cooperation, where every action mattered and contributed to the whole. The thought fascinated him. Here, women led, protected, and provided in a way that was strong, practical, and inspiring. As the sun began to lower in the sky, the leader, whose name John would later learn was a huli, approached him again. She gestured for him to stand, then led him into the larger building at the center of the village. Inside, the room was simple but beautifully arranged. There were mats on the floor, woven baskets along the walls, and carvings that depicted animals, nature, and human figures. The room seemed sacred, though not in a way John could immediately describe. Ahuli motioned for him to sit, then placed a small, carved amulet in front of him. He could tell that it was significant. She spoke again, slowly, pointing at the amulet, then at him, then toward the sky. John's heart raced as he realized she was trying to communicate something important about him, or perhaps about a role he might play here. He tried to convey understanding, nodding and showing respect, though he had no idea what she truly meant. The other women stood around quietly, their expressions serious but calm, waiting for some kind of signal. John felt both nervous and strangely honored. It was as if he had stepped into a story far larger than himself, one that had been unfolding long before he arrived. As night fell, the village lit small fires, creating a warm golden glow that reflected off the river and the stone buildings. John was guided to a small tent at the edge of the village. It was simple but clean, with soft mats to lie on. He sat for a long time, reflecting on the day. The fear he had felt when he was lost in the canyon had not disappeared, but it had shifted into curiosity and wonder. He had survived the desert, but now he was learning that survival was more than just food and water. It was also about understanding, respect, and connection with those around him. Sleep came slowly. Outside, he could hear the soft sounds of the village at night, laughter, whispers, the rustle of leaves, and the distant sound of flowing water. For the first time in many hours, John felt safe, not because he was in control, but because he had learned that he was in the care of a society that valued order, skill, and harmony. It was a humbling experience, and he realized how little he truly knew about the world around him. Even in his dreams, John could not escape the wonder of the village. He dreamed of walking along the river, speaking with the women, learning their ways, and understanding the meaning of the amulet Ahuli had given him. Though he did not yet know the answers, he felt that this night marked the beginning of a journey, one that would teach him lessons far beyond the physical challenges of the desert. The canyon and the wilderness were only the beginning. The real discovery was learning to connect with a culture and people entirely different from his own. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the cliffs, John was awake, filled with anticipation. Oh! Today he would begin to learn more about these women, their lives, and their customs. He did not yet know what it would entail, or whether he would ever fully understand it. But for the first time since he had gotten lost, he felt a sense of purpose, a desire to observe, respect, and learn. His adventure had become something John Thompson woke before the sun had fully risen. The village was quiet, the only sounds coming from the gentle flow of the river and the occasional stir of birds in the trees. Even in the early morning, there was a sense of purpose and order in the way the women moved. Some were already preparing food, while others tended to small fires or gathered water. John sat on the edge of his mat, unsure what the day would bring. He remembered the carved amulet Ahuli had placed in front of him last night, and he wondered about its meaning. Something about it felt important, as if it was a key to understanding the tribe and their customs. After a short while, Ahuli appeared at the entrance of the tent. Her presence alone commanded attention, calm, confident, and radiating authority. She gestured for John to follow her, and he rose carefully, still trying to hide his nervousness. As he walked beside her, he noticed that the other women moved aside respectfully, their eyes following him, but without hostility. John felt a mixture of awe and anxiety. He did not understand the words Ahuli spoke, but her gestures were clear and deliberate. She was leading him to a central area of the village, a place that seemed more important than any he had seen so far. They arrived at a large open space near the center of the village. Here the air felt different, heavier, filled with a quiet intensity. Several women were already gathered, standing in a semicircle, their expressions serious and attentive. John realized this was no ordinary gathering. It was something formal, something that required focus and respect. He could feel his heart pounding. He did not know what he was expected to do, but he understood that this was a significant moment. Ahuli motioned for him to stand in the middle of the circle. Every eye was on him. Everyone. Ahuli spoke slowly, pointing first to John, then to the amulet, then to the sky. Though he could not understand the words, John began to sense the meaning. The women were discussing him, his arrival, and perhaps the role he was meant to play. Ahuli's expression was calm but firm, and John felt the weight of her gaze. There was no anger, but there was authority, the kind that commanded respect without raising a voice. John bowed his head slightly, signaling that he was ready to listen and follow. One of the women stepped forward, carrying a bundle of herbs and small feathers. She approached John carefully, placing the items in his hands. He noticed that each piece seemed symbolic, the feathers delicate and precise, the herbs fragrant and carefully tied together. The woman gestured to John to hold them close to his chest. He did so, feeling an odd warmth and energy in his hands. Then Ahuli came closer, kneeling slightly so that her eyes were level with his. She pointed to the amulet, then at John, and finally made a motion that seemed to connect him with the items he was holding. It was then that John began to understand. He had not been found by accident. Ahuli was speaking of a prophecy, an event that had been spoken of long before he arrived. The stranger who would come lost in the desert, she seemed to say, was chosen to witness, learn, and carry a message back to the wider world. John's pulse quickened. The idea seemed impossible, yet the sincerity in Ahuli's eyes made him pause. He realized that this moment was more than a test. It was a recognition, a careful selection guided by knowledge he could not yet comprehend. The women around the circle began to chant softly, a melodic and rhythmic sound that filled the air with a sense of reverence. John's hands trembled as he held the feathers and herbs, unsure of how to respond. He could feel the energy of the group, the connection between each member of the tribe, and the weight of their history. For a moment, he felt small and insignificant, just a lone stranger in a world much larger and more complex than he had ever imagined. Yet at the same time, he felt honored. He had been given a role, however mysterious, in something sacred and ancient. Ahuli then performed a series of deliberate gestures, which John tried to mimic. She pointed to the ground, then to the sky, then back to herself, and finally to him. Each movement seemed to symbolize a connection between the land, the tribe, and the chosen stranger. John realized that he was participating in a ritual, one that had been practiced for generations. His nervousness slowly gave way to focus. He wanted to do everything correctly, to show respect and gratitude. Each movement he made was careful, deliberate, and full of intent. The chanting grew louder, yet it was not overwhelming. Instead, it created a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with John's own heartbeat. He could feel a connection forming not just with Ahuli, but with the women around him and the land itself. He realized that he was learning something far beyond physical survival. He was learning about trust, respect, and the ways of a culture that had lived in harmony with the wilderness for centuries. Every gesture, every word, every symbol mattered, and he could sense the weight of history in their actions. After several minutes, Ahuli knelt and placed her hand gently on the amulet, then on John's chest. He felt a warmth spread through him, a quiet reassurance. It was a signal, he realized, that he was accepted, that he had passed the first stage of being chosen. The women around him nodded, some smiling softly, others observing quietly. John felt a mixture of relief, gratitude, and awe. The fear that had gripped him when he was lost in the desert had not disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something different, a sense of purpose and responsibility. Ahuli then led him to a small fire at the edge of the circle. She gestured for him to sit, and the other women followed, arranging themselves in a respectful semicircle. She spoke again, pointing to the amulet, to the sky, and finally to John. Though the words were foreign, the meaning was clear. He was now part of a sacred trust. The tribe had chosen him to witness their traditions, to learn, and perhaps to carry this knowledge beyond the hidden valley. John could hardly believe it. He had come to the desert seeking adventure, but he had stumbled into a moment that was far beyond anything he could have imagined. Over the next few hours, John observed Ahuli closely. She was a leader not by force, but by knowledge, wisdom, and presence. Every word she spoke, every gesture she made, carried meaning. She instructed the women in tasks, guided them in ceremonies, and taught lessons that combined practical survival skills with spiritual understanding. John tried to follow her carefully, mimicking her movements, paying attention to every detail. He realized that being chosen was not about privilege or reward. It was about learning, understanding, and demonstrating respect for a way of life that had survived for generations. As the day progressed, John began to understand the structure of the tribe. Each woman had a role, and each role contributed to the survival and harmony of the group. There was no chaos, no unnecessary competition. Instead, there was a rhythm, a flow of work and responsibility that allowed the tribe to function efficiently and peacefully. John marveled at the precision and care with which every task was performed. From tending gardens to preparing meals, from teaching the younger members to crafting tools, everything was done with thought and intention. Ahuli observed John throughout the day, occasionally correcting his gestures or showing him the proper way to perform a task. Her corrections were firm but gentle, a combination of authority and patience. She seemed to understand that John was an outsider, yet she treated him as someone worthy of guidance and teaching. He felt a growing respect for her, not just as a leader, but as a person who had mastered the art of guiding, protecting, and inspiring her community. By the time the sun began to set, John had learned enough to feel a sense of accomplishment, but he also realized how much more there was to understand. Ahuli gathered the women around the central fire again and turned to John. She held out the amulet, then gestured toward the sky, the land, and finally to him. John understood that this was a moment of recognition. He had been observed, tested, and accepted. He was now officially chosen, not as a leader or a warrior, but as a witness and a learner. That night, John lay on his mat, reflecting on the day's events. The fear he had felt when he was lost in the canyon had transformed into something profound. He was no longer merely surviving. He was part of a story, a tradition, and a culture that had endured for centuries. He realized that being chosen was both an honor and a responsibility. He had entered the tribe's world as an outsider, but he would leave with knowledge, respect, and a deep understanding of their ways. Sleep came slowly, but it was different from the restless night he had spent alone in the canyon. Now there was purpose, connection, and meaning. The desert was no longer just a vast, empty wilderness. It was a living, breathing world filled with wisdom, strength, and beauty. John knew that the days ahead would challenge him in ways he had never imagined, but he also knew that he was ready to learn, observe, and grow. The morning sun rose gently over the hidden valley, painting the cliffs and river with soft, golden light. John Thompson woke with a sense of purpose he had never felt before. Last night's experiences with the tribe had left him in awe, but also filled him with questions. What did it truly mean to be chosen? How could he honor this trust and understanding the tribe had given him? He knew that today, like every day forward, would be a lesson, one that required patience, attention, and humility. Ahuli, the tribe's queen, appeared at the entrance of his tent without a sound, as if she had emerged from the desert itself. Her presence was commanding yet calm, and John immediately understood that he was expected to follow her. She gestured for him to rise and led him toward the river, where several women were already engaged in their morning routines. John noticed how everyone worked together seamlessly, moving with purpose and rhythm. Nothing felt hurried, yet nothing was wasted. Every action seemed deliberate, as if the tribe had mastered the art of efficiency and harmony over generations. Ahuli stopped near the river and pointed to a small basket of freshly caught fish. Then she gestured toward John, and he understood that today he would learn how to fish, not merely for survival, but as part of the tribe's traditions. He knelt beside her, watching closely as she demonstrated the process. Her hands were steady, precise, and patient. She showed him how to use the simple hooks and lines, how to feel for movement in the water, and how to respect the river that provided for them. John tried to imitate her, fumbling at first, but Ahuli's eyes held no impatience. She simply guided him gently, repeating each step until he understood. As the hours passed, John realized that every lesson in the village was about more than technique. It was about connection. The tribe did not merely hunt or fish. They observed, listened, and learned from the land itself. Ahuli often paused, pointing out subtle signs, the movement of a bird, the flow of water, the growth of plants. She explained, through gestures and simple words, that survival and understanding were inseparable. One had to respect nature, study it, and move in harmony with it, rather than trying to dominate it. John felt humbled. In his past hiking trips, he had relied on maps, tools, and knowledge, but here he was learning a deeper, quieter wisdom. By midday, John's muscles ached, and his hands were scratched from handling tools and fish. But his mind was alert. The other women had begun teaching him tasks he had never imagined, making simple shelters from branches, preparing food using techniques passed down for generations, and observing small medicinal plants along the riverbank. Every moment was a challenge, yet it was also rewarding. He felt a deep satisfaction in accomplishing even the smallest task correctly, knowing that it contributed to the life and harmony of the tribe. At one point, Ahuli took John aside. She gestured toward the village and then toward him, emphasizing the importance of community. She guided him to a younger woman who appeared to be struggling with a weaving task. John watched as Ahuli explained, with gestures and patience, how he could assist. Though he had no prior experience, he tried his best to follow the instructions. The young woman smiled at him when he succeeded in completing the basic pattern. John realized that being chosen also meant learning to work alongside others, to understand the value of helping and listening, even when he felt like an outsider. The afternoon brought a new challenge, a small journey into the surrounding hills to gather herbs and plants. Ahuli walked ahead, her movements confident and fluid, while John followed, trying not to disturb the delicate balance of nature around him. She stopped frequently to point out specific plants, explaining their uses for food, medicine, or spiritual purposes. John carefully noted each detail, trying to remember the names and purposes of the plants, knowing that any mistake could affect the tribe's way of life. For hours they walked, collecting and examining, and John felt a deepening respect for the knowledge that had been passed down through generations. Back in the village, John attempted to replicate some of the tasks he had observed. He built a small shelter near the river, carefully weaving branches together under Ahuli's watchful eye. Though it was far from perfect, she nodded in approval, a small smile crossing her face. He realized that learning here was not about speed or perfection, but about understanding, observation, and intention. Each effort, no matter how simple, had meaning. He began to internalize the rhythm of life in the village, noticing how each action, from preparing food to maintaining tools, contributed to the well-being of the entire community. As the sun began to set, Ahuli gathered John and the other women around a central fire. Tonight the focus was on storytelling, a ritual he had observed before but not fully understood. The women sat in a circle, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames, and began to share stories of the tribe's history, ancestors, and important lessons. Though John could not understand every word, the tone, gestures, and expressions conveyed a richness of culture, wisdom, and emotion. He realized that storytelling was not just entertainment, it was teaching, preserving knowledge, and connecting generations. John listened intently, trying to absorb the meaning behind each story. He learned of great journeys, struggles against harsh weather, moments of bravery, and the importance of trust and cooperation. He saw the pride in each woman's eyes as they recounted these stories, and he began to understand the deep connection the tribe had to their land and each other. Ahuli's role became even clearer to him. She was not just a leader, but a guardian of knowledge, tradition, and the spiritual well-being of her people. Later, Ahuli approached John again. She gestured toward the stars as night settled over the village, then pointed to him and the amulet. John felt a deep, almost electric, connection in that moment. He understood that being chosen was not about authority or privilege. It was about witnessing, learning, and respecting the traditions and wisdom of the tribe. The responsibility weighed on him, but he also felt an immense honor. He had come to the desert seeking adventure, but he had found something far greater: insight into a culture that balanced strength, skill, and compassion in ways he had never experienced. Throughout the night, John reflected on the lessons he had learned. He realized that the challenges he faced in the village, from learning tasks to understanding rituals, were not tests of physical strength alone. They were tests of patience, humility, observation, and respect. Each success required careful attention, thoughtful effort, and a willingness to listen. He understood that the tribe's survival depended on more than hunting or gathering. It depended on cooperation, knowledge, and the ability to live in harmony with both nature and each other. John also began to notice changes within himself. His fears and anxieties from being lost in the canyon had shifted into curiosity and determination. He felt a growing sense of purpose and connection to the people around him. The lessons were not easy. Many times he failed, fumbling with tools or forgetting steps, but each mistake taught him more than any success could. He began to see that learning, observing, and respecting the process were just as important as completing the task itself. By the time dawn broke again over the cliffs, John was exhausted but fulfilled. He had learned to fish, gather, prepare food, craft simple tools, and assist in communal tasks. He had observed rituals, listened to stories, and begun to internalize the values that guided the tribe. The experience was transforming him, not just as a hiker or adventurer, but as a person who was beginning to understand the importance of patience, observation, and humility. Ahuli appeared at his tent once more, gesturing for him to rise. She led him to a spot overlooking the valley, where the entire tribe could be seen preparing for the day. John took a deep breath, feeling a mix of pride, respect, and anticipation. He knew that there were still many lessons ahead, challenges he had yet to face, and deeper wisdom to uncover. But he also knew that he had been accepted, not as an outsider, but as someone who had earned the right to learn, observe, and honor their ways. In that moment, John felt a profound shift within himself. The desert, the canyon, and the initial fear of being lost seemed distant now, replaced by a sense of belonging, purpose, and connection. He understood that the journey ahead would test him, not with danger alone, but with challenges of understanding, patience, and respect. He was no longer just a visitor in the tribe. He was a participant, a learner, and a witness to a culture that had survived and thrived for generations. As John prepared for another day of lessons, he reflected on how far he had come. He had entered the village afraid, uncertain, and exhausted. Now he was aware, attentive, and deeply respectful of the life around him. Each day in the tribe's world offered a new understanding, a new skill, and a deeper appreciation for the balance and harmony that guided their lives. He realized that being chosen was not about privilege. It was about responsibility, learning, and growth. The morning sun rose over the hidden valley once more, casting long golden rays across the cliffs and river. John Thompson woke with a mix of anticipation and a quiet sadness. He had learned so much, grown so much, and felt a deep connection to the women who had guided him through this extraordinary journey. Yet he knew that today would be different. Today he would face the moment of release, the time when he would leave the tribe, return to the world he had left behind, and carry the lessons he had learned with him. Ahuli appeared as she always did, calm and commanding. She gestured for John to rise and follow her. The other women stood quietly in the village, their eyes focused, their movements deliberate. The atmosphere was different from the previous days. There was a sense of ceremony, of importance. John realized that his departure would not be simple. He had been chosen, yes, but he also understood that being chosen carried responsibility. He needed to leave with respect, understanding, and gratitude. Ahuli led him to the central fire circle, where all the women were gathered. They formed a semicircle, their expressions serious but warm. She placed the carved amulet back in front of him, its significance now clear. This small object had represented his acceptance, his connection, and his role as a witness. Ahuli pointed to him, then to the amulet, and finally toward the sky. John felt the weight of her gesture. He was being entrusted with knowledge, understanding, and the memory of a culture that had survived against the odds. The women began to chant softly, a melody that resonated deeply within John's chest. The sound was rhythmic and gentle, yet filled with power and meaning. He watched the flames dance in the fire, feeling a sense of connection to everyone around him. Each face reflected history, wisdom, and resilience. John understood, in a way words could never fully express, that he was witnessing something sacred. This was a culture that had survived in harmony with the land, and now, for a brief moment, he had been allowed to enter their world. Ahuli then approached John again, kneeling slightly so their eyes met. She gestured to him to repeat certain movements, rituals he had learned over the past days. He followed carefully, mindful not to make a mistake. Every step, every gesture mattered, and he felt a deep responsibility to honor the tribe's traditions. When he completed the final movements correctly, Ahuli smiled, a subtle but profound gesture of approval. The other women nodded, some placing their hands over their hearts, as if acknowledging that John had fulfilled the role they had set before him. After the ritual, Ahuli guided John to a small, elevated point overlooking the valley. From here, he could see the entire village, the river winding through it, the women moving gracefully, tending to their daily work, and the small fires that had been lit in the early morning. The scene was breathtaking, and John felt a lump in his throat. He had come to this place lost, scared, and uncertain. Now he was leaving with understanding, respect, and a sense of purpose he had never imagined. Ahuli handed John a small bundle of herbs, feathers, and simple tools, gifts for his journey back. She pointed to the river, then to him, and finally to the horizon, signaling that it was time to go. John accepted the gifts with gratitude, understanding their significance. They were not just objects, they were symbols of trust, knowledge, and connection. He felt a mixture of pride and humility. He had been tested, observed, and guided, and now he was entrusted with the responsibility of carrying a piece of the tribe's wisdom beyond the hidden valley. As John prepared to leave, the other women came forward, offering small gestures of farewell, smiles, nods, and gentle touches on the shoulder. There was no sadness, no dramatic display, just a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that had been formed. John realized that this was the true strength of the tribe, not physical power, but connection, understanding, and respect. They had accepted him, taught him, and now released him, trusting that he would honor their ways in the world beyond. The journey back to the main trail was quiet and reflective. John walked slowly, careful to remember the paths, landmarks, and signs that Ahuli had shown him. Each step was deliberate, as if he was carrying not just his own life, but the weight of the knowledge he had been given. He felt a sense of responsibility that went beyond survival. He had been entrusted with wisdom, tradition, and trust, and he understood that this journey was more than a physical one. It was a journey of understanding, humility, and respect. As he descended the hidden valley and reached the familiar cliffs and open terrain, John paused to look back. The village, hidden from the world, seemed like a vision from a dream. He could see the small figures of women moving about, maintaining their harmony and order. A wave of gratitude washed over him. He knew that few would ever see this place, let alone understand the depth of its culture. Yet he carried it within him, a memory and a lesson that would shape the rest of his life. By mid-morning, John reached the edge of the canyon where he had first become lost. The sun was higher now, and the world outside the hidden valley seemed ordinary, yet it was different to him. He had been transformed by his experience. The desert was no longer just a place of danger and uncertainty. It was a place of discovery, connection, and growth. He felt a renewed sense of confidence, not arrogance, but humility. The kind that comes from understanding that life is far larger and more complex than one person can ever fully grasp. On the way back to the main road, John reflected on the lessons he had learned from the tribe. He remembered Ahuli's patience, the women's skill, the rituals, and the stories shared around the fires. Each experience had taught him something vital: the importance of observing before acting, respecting others and the land, and understanding the value of community. He realized that these lessons were not just for survival in the wilderness, but for life itself. They applied to how he treated people, how he approached challenges, and how he understood the world around him. When John finally emerged onto the main trail, he was greeted by the familiar sounds of civilization, distant voices, the hum of vehicles, and the wind rustling through the trees. Yet, he felt a quiet distance from it all. The world he had returned to seemed smaller, less vibrant, and less connected than the hidden valley. He understood with clarity that the true value of his journey lay not in returning, but in carrying the knowledge and understanding he had gained. Every decision, every action, every interaction from this day forward would be influenced by what he had learned from Ahuli and the women of the tribe. In the weeks that followed, John found it difficult to explain his experience to others. Friends and family were curious, asking questions, but he quickly realized that few could understand. They would not comprehend the significance of the rituals, the subtle lessons of observation and patience, or the profound connection to the land and community that he had witnessed. Yet he did not mind. He understood that his journey was personal, a chapter of life that could only be truly appreciated by those who had walked the same path. John carried the small bundle of herbs, feathers, and tools with him as reminders of the tribe's wisdom. He placed them carefully in his home, not as trophies, but as symbols of responsibility, respect, and memory. Each time he looked at them, he remembered the faces of the women, the calm authority of Ahuli, and the harmony of the hidden valley. He remembered the lessons learned: patience, observation, humility, and the importance of understanding the balance of life around him. These were lessons that could not be taught through books or lectures. They could only be experienced and carried in the heart. Months later, John often thought back to that time in the desert. He realized that being chosen by Ahuli and the tribe had changed him profoundly. He approached life differently, with greater mindfulness, patience, and respect for both people and nature. The fear he had once carried when lost in the canyon had been replaced by confidence and clarity. He knew that true strength came not from dominance or control, but from understanding, humility, and the ability to learn from those around him. The hidden valley, the tribe, and the lessons of Ahuli remained with John forever. Though he returned to the world of roads, cities, and noise, he carried a secret wisdom within him, a quiet, enduring understanding of harmony, skill, and respect. He knew that this journey had been more than an adventure. It had been a transformation. He had entered the wilderness, lost, uncertain, and alone. But he left with knowledge, purpose, and a deep sense of connection to a world he would never forget.